June 7, 2026, 2200. Professor Namyong Lee's Global Political News, Long, Diagnosing the Causes of the Controversy Surrounding the Poor Administration of South Korea's June 3rd Local Elections, Through the Structure of Election Management Personnel. Hello, this is Professor Namyong Lee. Today, I would like to analyze the controversy surrounding ballot shortages and election administration failures in South Korea's June 3rd local elections using numbers rather than emotions. Elections are the heart of democracy. But would citizens feel safe if a hospital performing heart surgery had judges serving as doctors, temporary workers serving as nurses, and an operating room director with limited administrative management experience? The core issue is not simply a shortage of ballot papers, it is the overall failure of management capability, personnel structure, professional expertise, and field control within the election administration system. First, let us look at the scale of the operation. A total of 14,228 polling stations and 258 counting centers were operated nationwide. Approximately 197,000 personnel were assigned to polling operations, while 117,000 personnel were assigned to vote counting, for a total workforce of 314,000 people. Numerically, this means that each polling station had an average of 13.8 election workers, while each counting center had an average of 453 personnel. This is not a small event. It is a national project comparable in scale to the FIFA World Cup, the Olympic Games, or a nationwide disaster response exercise. Yet the highest leadership positions in this massive operation are largely structured around judges rather than logistics specialists, data analysts, or crisis management professionals. This, in my view, represents the most significant structural weakness. Second, let us examine the structure of the National Election Commission. The National Election Commission consists of 9 commissioners, 3 appointed by the President, 3 elected by the National Assembly, and 3 designated by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. At first glance, this appears to be a balanced structure reflecting the separation of powers. In practice, however, the chairmanship is traditionally held by a Supreme Court justice. The problem is that judges are experts in legal judgments, not project managers responsible for directing 314,000 field personnel. A courtroom requires the evaluation of evidence and the interpretation of law. Election administration requires demand forecasting, ballot printing, distribution, storage, transportation, inventory management, emergency replenishment, public complaints management, coordination with law enforcement, media response, and cybersecurity management. These tasks require operational leadership and executive management skills rather than judicial writing skills. Third, the structure of provincial and local election commissions also deserves scrutiny. South Korea has 17 metropolitan and provincial election commissions and approximately 250 city, county, and district election commissions. If each commission consists of 9 members, this results in approximately 153 provincial commissioners and 2,250 local commissioners nationwide. When township-level commissions are included, the total number of commissioners reaches many thousands. The number of officials, however, does not automatically translate into expertise. The critical issue is not how many titles exist, but how accountability is assigned. Who calculated ballot demand? Who evaluated the risk of shortages? Who established reserve inventory standards? Who issued emergency replenishment orders when shortages occurred? If these questions cannot be clearly answered, then the organization may have many officials but no identifiable accountability. Fourth, a large portion of election personnel are temporary appointees. Polling supervisors, polling clerks, counting clerks, guides, and order maintenance personnel are recruited in large numbers for each election. Again, 314,000 individuals participated in election operations. However, if most of these workers are not career election professionals with long-term training, field response capabilities will inevitably be limited. Imagine an airline hiring temporary pilots and temporary air traffic controllers only for a holiday weekend. Few passengers would willingly board those aircraft. The same principle applies to elections. Voting is the aircraft of popular sovereignty, and the Election Commission is the control tower. If the control tower depends heavily on temporary personnel and inadequate operational manuals, problems become predictable. Therefore, election responsibilities should be integrated into the permanent administrative structure of government while minimizing dependence on outsourced or temporary election management functions. Fifth, the most revealing figure is the average of 13.8 personnel per polling station. At first glance, this appears sufficient. However, local elections are more complex than presidential elections. Voters often receive multiple ballots covering different offices and levels of government. Candidates, parties, regional offices, and proportional representation systems overlap. Success cannot be achieved merely by matching the number of polling stations with the number of workers. Local elections require sophisticated forecasting based on expected voter turnout, advanced voting patterns, regional turnout recovery rates, and peak hour demand. If ballot shortages occurred, this was not merely the fault of several polling workers. It represented a failure of demand forecasting by central and regional leadership. Judges are accustomed to reviewing cases presented by plaintiffs, defendants, and attorneys. Election administration requires direct operational execution rather than passive review. Sixth, the figure of 453 personnel per counting center is also significant. Each counting center functions like a small factory. Factories require production managers, logistics managers, quality control managers, security managers, and emergency response managers. Election counting centers are, in effect, semiconductor factories for democracy. If a single wafer disappears in a semiconductor plant, a major investigation follows. When ballots or ballot boxes are poorly managed, the consequences are even more serious. A defective semiconductor creates a corporate loss. Poor election administration creates a loss of public legitimacy. Seventh, the judge-centered leadership model should be fundamentally reconsidered, and judges should focus primarily on judicial responsibilities. Judges are experts in legal interpretation. Election administration, however, requires expertise in law, statistics, cybersecurity, logistics, public administration, crisis management, and auditing. Global best practices rely on balanced teams of specialists rather than a single professional background. Countries such as Canada, Germany, and Switzerland focus not on speed of results, but on procedural trust and verifiability. South Korea should move beyond a model in which a Supreme Court justice serves as chair. Korea election officials continue existing practices, and temporary workers fill operational gaps. From a cost-effectiveness perspective, some argue that election administration should be transferred to the Ministry of the Interior and Safety, while the existing election commission structure is fundamentally reorganized. Eighth, accountability is blurred. The structure includes the chairperson, standing commissioners, secretary general, deputy secretary general, provincial commissions, local commissions, and township-level commissions. When failures occur, responsibility becomes difficult to identify. Healthy organizations have clear lines of accountability during crises. Weak organizations distribute authority widely during normal times and distribute responsibility nowhere during failures. The ballot shortage controversy exposed precisely this problem. The officials responsible for demand forecasting, printing, distribution, inventory management, and emergency replenishment should be publicly identified by name and position. This is consistent with global standards of accountability. Ninth, the Election Commission should not hide behind institutional independence. Independence is not a license for a lack of accountability. Independence requires higher expertise, stricter auditing, and greater transparency. Just as judicial independence does not excuse poor management of court records, institutional independence does not excuse ballot shortages. The voting rights of citizens are more important than administrative convenience. 10th, the key equation is simple. If ballot shortages occur despite deploying 314,000 personnel, the problem is not manpower, but leadership. If confusion occurs despite assigning 13.8 workers per polling station, the issue is not headcount, but training and operational procedures. If an organizational structure consisting of 9 central commissioners, 153 provincial commissioners, and approximately 2,250 local commissioners still lacks visible accountability, then the organizational design itself must be questioned. Even a chairperson with judicial authority cannot protect an election if logistics systems and data forecasting fail. In conclusion, South Korea must reform its election administration system to ensure the quality and credibility of public elections. Some reform advocates argue that election responsibilities should be transferred to the Ministry of the Interior and Safety, with the minister serving ex officio as election administrator. Specialized temporary election offices should include statisticians, logistics experts, cybersecurity professionals, and quality control specialists. Formulas for ballot allocation, reserve inventory standards, emergency replenishment procedures, responsible officials, and incident reports should all be publicly disclosed. Liberal democracy is not protected merely by people wearing judicial robes. Democracy is protected by numbers, systems, accountability, and expertise. If election administration continues to be directed by officials more focused on caution than operational leadership, systemic failures will continue. A citizen's vote is not a legal document. It is an expression of national sovereignty. Organizations that fail to safeguard that sovereignty must be reformed, and those responsible must be held accountable. Bringing Korea's future into a global perspective, this is Professor Namyong Lee TV. Your subscriptions and likes are a powerful force for building a brighter future for Korea. Thank you.